Poddin My Noggin, hosted by CK Sims, creating a platform to elevate, educate, and heal by creating a space where people can share their stories of struggle, triumph, and redemption. CKS Media.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Poddin My Noggin. I'm your host, CK Sims, and today we are joined by a relatively new author, Mr. David Maeda. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, CK. It's great to be here today.
Wonderful. So, first question I have for you is, how are you feeling right now in this moment?
I've been having some struggles with depression, which is not new for me. It was really exciting publishing the book. It got published in December, and I think I'm feeling a little bit of a letdown now,
Yes.
which I think is natural. I mean, it's great to have the story out into the world, but now what?
Well, I think that that's how life goes sometimes, right? Especially I was reading on your blog sort of how this has been a multi-decade sort of venture, if you will, to get this book put together and released. And the book, for anyone listening that we're talking about, is This Is Not Who We Are. So I was reading, and I think it was July. The second post that you wrote on your website was July of last year. And I think you were in getting treatment.
Yep.
And then, which I'm also slightly fascinated by, because I'm not known, or I don't know if I'm from Canada, so I don't know if we use that same sort of treatment method here. I couldn't tell you whether we do or not. So I'm very intrigued by that. But so for everybody at home, David Maeda is correct? Former elections official from Minnesota. And you were the director of?
Yeah, I was the director of elections for the Secretary of State in Minnesota.
Yes. And that was from 2019 to 2024. Right? But you've been in elections for a really long time.
It was about a 25-year career that, as we mentioned, came to an end last December.
And was that by choice? Like you chose to step down or voted out, or how did that happen?
Some of the backstory on this is I was ready to publish the memoir at the end of 2023, and our HR and attorney told me it would be a violation of the state's code of ethics if I did so. They felt like I was using my personal position for private gain, which I did not agree with, because the book isn't solely about my time in elections. It's about other aspects of my life. So I didn't publish for about a year, and then I decided I needed to publish, and that kind of prompted me to retire and leave the position.
Okay. That's a bold move, but I can respect that, because it was something that you absolutely had to get out. So there's, like, as a rule of thumb, I don't research my guest too deeply until just before I join a chat. And the reason I do that is because I don't want to formulate too many questions in advance. I want to have more of a conversation. So I'm reading over here, what you've written to me, some of your blog about the book, that sort of thing. And all of these things are firing off in my brain, right? And I'm
that's interesting.
I'm like, because I'm like, I want to talk about the book and I want to talk about your life, but like, I am slightly itching, I guess, to talk somewhat about the climate of the election process in 2020. You mentioned this in your blog. And I think to myself, how very stressful that process must have been for someone in your position.
Yeah, it was off the charts, and it hasn't exactly lessened since 2020. 2024 is pretty stressful as well. So when I started my career in elections, the things I used to worry were like running out of ballots, or a voter showing up at the wrong polling place and not having time to get to the correct polling place. So it was stressful because voters don't like you screwing up their votes. They get very huffy about that, and I understand that. So the focus up until 2020 was really on making sure we had all the logistics in place. And it's a very complicated process. It's not just happening on one day. I like to compare it to like a wedding, where you're doing all these little things in preparation for the one day. And so that up until 2020, that was really the focus of the position. That it was stressful, but you always knew by when election day was over, things would lighten up a bit. In 2020, obviously that didn't happen. It just continued on with people now alleging not only was there voter fraud, which there's not, but that there are voter administration fraud, that we were not getting the results of the election correct. And that was totally based on misinformation. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write the book is write about all the little steps we take in election administration that ensures elections are fair and secure. And those things occurred in 2020. They occurred in 2024. They occurred at every election that I was part of.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating sort of topic because when you have someone in a position of power start to sort of spread mass misinformation about widespread voter fraud, all of those things, which is interesting because he didn't make those claims in 2024,
Right.
right?
Right.
And like it's just a really interesting thing to look at when somebody does that, but he didn't make any claims about potential voter fraud or anything like that when he won, right? So, but yeah, I just find that whole process very very interesting, and like I don't know every step or all of the nitty gritty when it comes to how voting is set up for people, how it's secure, and there are checks and balances in place to ensure that fraud doesn't happen. Um, but like I know enough to know that it's not just like David shows up the morning of what was
Right.
it, November 5th, and he's like, all right, everybody, here's some paper, and I understand that it is a massive event that probably takes 4 years to set up properly and make sure everybody's getting their ballots and things are done appropriately. So if you're interested in learning more about the election process, then This Is Not Who We Are would be a good book to pick up and read, to find out some of those little minuscule, and I say minuscule, but they're not minuscule by nature, but like the nitty gritty of what it takes to run a state election.
I would agree that in part of the book, I tell some of my war stories. Some of the times things didn't go the way we planned it, and we had to do the things to recover from either a mistake or something just didn't go right. So a lot of the elections chapter is about things that didn't go right, but it then reinforces the fact that we're really doing all these little things to make sure things go right, I think.
Well, and yeah, of course. So I mean, that's a long career in elections. How did you end up in said career? What was the draw, or was it one of those situations where it happened by happenstance?
It was totally by accident. So when I graduated college with a history and journalism degree, and I always thought I was going to become a newspaper reporter. Well, I was pretty burnt out at the end of college, so I decided to take a little bit of a break, and I was working retail at a music store. And I was playing softball one summer with my roommate's softball team. And one of the members of the team, his mom is the one that gets people hired at the state. And so he talked to me and said, would you be interested in working for the state government? And I thought, well, that's better than retail. It's a little bit more pay, it's a little bit better benefits. I've always been interested in politics and government. So I got a job actually with the Secretary of State's office. It was a clerical entry level position in the business services part of the office, which is by far and away the biggest part. Biggest part of the office. Elections is just a very tiny part of what the Secretary of State does. But on election night, the elections folk would always ask others in the office for help because there was plenty of work to do on election night. So I always volunteered, and I just found it fascinating. And this led me developing a friendship with the director of elections at the time, a man named Joe Mansky, who eventually helped me get a job with one of our counties, Washington County, which is on the eastern part of the Twin Cities. And I was the election supervisor, but again, the only experience I had was on election night, a couple of elections. I mean, it was the proverbial drinking water out of a fire hose because I started within like 2 months of our primary. And so it was really a steep learning curve. But I found it fascinating. And the times I thought about leaving and doing something else, I always got drawn back in. I eventually worked for Hennepin County, which is the largest county in Minnesota. It's where Minneapolis is located. So that was a big job, being their election supervisor. And then again, I decided I was going to step away from elections, and I became the Minnetonka city clerk. Minnetonka is a suburb of Minneapolis. And as city clerk, I had a bunch of duties. One of them was running the elections for the city. So I was still involved in elections, but I was trying to focus my attention elsewhere. And that's when we had a big 2008 U.S. Senate recount with Al Franken and Norm Coleman that lasted well into the next year. So my wish to get away from elections didn't happen because the recount just sucked up all my time. And that kind of re-energized my interest in elections, and eventually led me to being appointed the director of elections for the state. So it was totally by accident, but there were several steps that I could have stepped away and I didn't, because it was rewarding work.
Yes, and it sounds like it has a fascinating appeal that keeps sort of pulling you in, like one of those
Yep.
things that they get your tentacles in you, and even though you're trying to break away, it kind of draws you back in. So, like, I'm going to ask, we'll focus just for a little bit on some of my questions. So, like, when you have to do a recount, like, first off, for everybody listening, I'm sure they're as curious as I am. So, when you are in ballot day, for instance, like, and people are casting their ballots, are there individuals counting ballots as they come in?
It really depends on where you live. And in Canada, it's probably entirely different than what we do down here. But um, for most of the United States, we have voting equipment. So it's optical scan technology where you fill in a bubble next to your vote and then you feed it into the machine. And the machine actually tabulates it at that point, but the officials in the polling place don't have access to the results until the end of the night when they run a results tape. So it's keeping a real time tabulation of the votes, but nobody can see it until the polls close at 8 p.m. here in Minnesota.
Really? So, okay. So everybody that's actually in the stations facilitating these elections and the polls and all that stuff, they're not privy to who's voting what. They're just scanning one of those things.
Right.
It's going into the system. The system's tabulating. There's no access to that information until after the polls close at, say, 8 p.m. And then a specialized team comes in to view those results. And is it per polling station or is it for all of
It's
Minnesota?
it's per polling station. We have about 4,000 in Minnesota. The ballots themselves don't actually get looked at on election night. The only time the ballots get looked at is if we have a recount. And that's, again, Minnesota specific. In Minnesota, when we do recounts, we require that it's a hand count. So we can verify that the machine actually counted the ballots correctly. That's kind of the purpose of the recount. Um,
Interesting.
So in
That,
2008, the recount I mentioned is a statewide recount. It is really the first statewide recount since the mid 1960s, and there were over 3 million ballots that had to be hand counted. So at the time I was with Minnetonka, and we used our city council chambers. We had a bunch of tables set up with two poll workers of different parties, so a Republican and a Democrat at a table, and then they would split the pile of ballots. This is a vote for Coleman. This is a vote for Frank, and the two candidates could have challengers at the table. So if a Coleman challenger thought that we miscounted a ballot for Frank, and he could challenge that ballot. And unfortunately, in Minnesota, we had an old law in the book where you can't put an identifying mark on your ballot. You can't put a mark that would tie the ballot back to you. And the reason that law was in place was people, when we did hand count ballots on election night, would pay people to vote a certain way. And to prove to the person who's paying you that you voted that way, you'd put a mark on the ballot that would identify the way you voted. And so this is an old law that was on the books in 2008. We still have it on the books. But what ended up happening was the challengers for both candidates just started challenging everything. If they saw a lipstick smear on a ballot, they would say that's an identifying mark. It shouldn't be counted. And it got to be crazy where every ballot was being challenged. Eventually, those all went up to a canvassing board at the Secretary of State's office, who had to make the decision, is this a legitimate vote for this candidate? Is this a legitimate vote for that candidate? That's why I think it took like 8 months to get the recount done.
wow. So I had no idea. And that's really interesting and fascinating. And so if there's a smudge or a lipstick stain or something like that, it can be challenged in a recount based on this law that you have it.
Right.
Wow. That I find that's fascinating. So like, and that's something that you're working on. You have 3 million votes. And I know that millions are often downplayed now in time, right? Like in this day and age, we got people with, you know, 25 million followers on Instagram, or this house costs $5 million, and we hear it so often that it doesn't seem like as much anymore to a degree. But I want people to visualize now having 3 million physical pieces of paper in a room that needs to be manually tabulated. And not even just so much as like, yep, that's this guy, yep, that's that guy. Having a person sitting on either side of you
Yeah.
saying, wait a second, no, 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 sorry. I'm going to challenge that one. Like, wow, 8 months. That's insane to me to think about that process. And then does this, and I'm not sure if you know the answer to this, but like from a federal standpoint, is this similar how it works?
Well, again, in the United States, every state has have their own election laws, but it's very common. Our model is very common across the country here. Most states utilize voting equipment. They don't do hand counts on election night. Um, there's different laws on who's actually eligible to vote. We just had a law change 2 years ago. It used to be if you're under a conviction of a felony, you couldn't vote. We got the law changed to if you were under conviction of a felony and incarcerated, you couldn't vote. But if you're under a conviction of a felony and you were living out in the world, you could vote. And the reason we did that from an election administration side was it was very confusing to know somebody's status. They might be charged with a felony, but not actually convicted of a felony. And
Mm-hmm.
so we would have to work with the court system for individual voters not knowing exactly if they're eligible to vote. Now our new law is if you're out, you can vote. And I think there's political aspects to that
Of
argument, but
course, yeah.
from an administrative side, it really made things a lot cleaner.
Well, now you have to think just the administrative lift period from running an election is like to me mind-boggling, right? And I know there's a lot of bodies, a lot of minds, a lot of equipment, a lot of like logistics that go into pulling this off. And then to have caveats where you have to take people to and sort it out in court if they were eligible. Like I'm just my brain is like thinking how much of a nightmare that would be, and just the additional layers that you would have to add on to an election.
And
And I just
getting back to your comments about counting 3 million ballots by hand, one of the attacks in 2024, there were people in our state and across the country that wanted us to stop using voting equipment and count everything by hand on election night. To your point, counting 3 million ballots divided by 4,000 different polling places might not be that challenging a thing. But in Minnesota, on our 2024 ballot, we had up to 35 to 40 races on it, everything from county commissioners, city council, attorney generals, county sheriffs. They're all on the ballot. And you have to count each race individually. You can't just look at a ballot with 35 races on it and determine this ballot is counted this way. You have to count each individual race. So you're counting the 3 million ballots 35 times, which if all the recounts I've ever been a part of, the voting equipment is so much more accurate than human beings. Human beings, you might think just stacking things is easy, but you make mistakes. In Minnesota, we have the pile of 25 method where once you have the pile of ballots for the candidate, then you count those into piles of 25, so you can easily go 25, 50, 75. But you'd be shocked how many times our poll workers counted piles of 24 or 26 or 27, and so the counts would be off, and we'd have to recount that pile of ballots, and it was always the machine that had counted it right. And so the idea of not using voting equipment to me in itself probably would have made me quit my job. it would have been that stressful.
Yeah, because I just, and wasn't in 2020, wasn't there recounts?
There were recounts at the local level, and then I think some states did recount the presidential race, but not in Minnesota.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. It's just, that's mind boggling to me. And so on the ballot, it says president and then you pick the person. And that's the fascinating difference between, politics in Canada versus politics in the US. So in Canada, we don't pick the prime minister,
Yep.
right? So Justin Trudeau currently, whoever it's going to be when they run the election this year, we pick our provincial premier, that party, and whoever gets, and I'm a crappy person to do it, but that's how we get our prime minister. So they represent the Liberal, which is our Democratic Party. Then we have our Conservative, which is our Republican Party, and then we have like the NDP, which is New Democratic, and a bunch of the little ones, just like you have. But how the prime minister takes power is through the election results of your local municipalities and MPs and premiers. So that is very different. So I find that fascinating. So we're going to take a quick break. Thank you very much for talking about all those election things, because I find that I could probably have conversations about that for hours. I find it very fascinating. When we get back, we're going to take a little look back at your life and at some of the not so cheerful pieces of what made up your memoir, This Is Not Who We Are. We'll be right back, everybody.
Partner today with CK Sims and Poddin My Noggin to get in front of an audience that cares. You will be supporting mental health stories, tales of resilience, and uplifting content, aligning your brand with bringing goodness, authenticity, and kindness front and center. This spot could be yours. Do you have a story of struggle and resilience? One that you want to share with others and possibly help someone through their own struggles? Find the link in the show description and fill out the guest form today.
Welcome back, everybody. Before the break, I was talking with David Maeda, and I'm hoping I'm saying your last name correctly,
Yep.
About his tenure with the Secretary of State, elections official, and some of the stories. And he was very polite and gracious in letting me ask some of my elections related questions, because I find it very fascinating. David has released a book in December of this past year, and it is called This Is Not Who We Are. David, tell us about this book and why that title?
So the title is kind of threefold. In 2020, during the pandemic, there was an increase in crimes against Asian Americans because of the Chinese origin of COVID. And I would watch the news and I would hear person after person say, "This is not who we are," meaning we don't attack people based on their race. But to me, it was who we are. This is happening increasingly. It happened in Minnesota. It happened across the country. It was horrible. And so I thought, the second reason I call it This Is Not Who We Are, I thought it'd be very cheeky to call a memoir This Is Not Who We Are, because you're supposed to write about who we are. The third reason I named it that, and I write about this in the book a lot, is the life and we talked about it on my career path, but the life I lived in becoming an election official was not the life I envisioned when I was sitting in college, dreaming of becoming a writer. It was completely up. The path I took was not the one I thought I would live. And so I've always thought about it, and I contemplated in the memoir, what would have my life have been like had things gone as I planned it? Would I be happier? Would I be not as satisfied? Because I had a very productive career, which gave my life a lot of meaning. Would I have been able to write a book? I don't even know that. So the life we live is the life we live. You can look back and regret things or wish things had been different, but it's kind of a pointless exercise to do that. One of the things I learned in the treatment this summer was to be more mindful about living in the moment, not worrying about what happened yesterday, not worrying too much about what's going to happen tomorrow. Just live in the moment is one of the things they really, really encourage us to do, and I think it does help.
That's one of the areas actually I struggle with is being present and in the moment. So it's we have a lot of parallels in not in say like our professional careers, but in our struggles with mental health. And I've sort of closed the book on living in the past and having regrets. I've made peace with that. I've forgiven myself, and we've moved on. Now, if I could just somehow work on and reduce the amount of living in the future and worrying about it and be in the moment, I would fare much better, right? And I do employ the practice, right? Like so right now I'm here with you. There's nothing else happening. There's nothing else going on in the world except for you and me in this conversation. So I'm able to
Right.
do that with certain things. But the second the camera goes off or I'm not focused in my job, my thoughts go to
Well, I don't think you're alone. I think it's a very hard thing to practice.
yeah.
Even now, I'm between jobs. I'm still going to work at something. I don't know what I'm going to do next. But being without a job since the end of last year has caused my anxiety to spike, and even thoughts like, "What if I never am able to get another job? What am I going to do? Am I going to end up on the street? What's going to happen to me?" So I can't let my mind go there. I have to focus on the day's tasks today. I have to get this done. I have to make sure my insurance is in place. Just, I don't know if that's living in the moment, but to your point, I think it's really hard to shut off what's going to happen tomorrow. It's easier to shut off what happened yesterday for me,
Yes,
too.
absolutely. I think one a therapist told me once, um, and this really resonated with me and helped me completely change my life. And we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So spending any time on it, really, worrying about it, not being proactive is completely fine. Worrying about it or stressing or getting ourselves worked up about it is not. Um, she was like, something that she said was, trust that you will show up for yourself, right?
I like that.
And that is something, if we look back in time, I want to talk about, back in time with you, but if you were to also look back in time through all of your hardships and your mental health struggles, you have shown up for yourself. And you need to trust that you will continue to do that.
Yep.
And so that was one of those profound things that someone said to me that made me realize I am always showing up for myself, regardless of what comes my way. I will be here and I will rise. So you talk about your struggles with mental health. I believe you had mental health struggles in high school, but they really kicked in during university.
Yeah, I think I've been depressed even before high school. I just didn't know what it was. I was very unhappy growing up, even though I had a wonderful family. I had friends. Um, it just seemed, I think, later on, much later on in life, I got diagnosed by somebody as having existential angst. And so I'm always constantly looking for the meaning behind things. And it's hard for
Mhm.
me to accept some things just happen. They don't have a greater meaning. But for me in high school in particular, I just thought like, why am I studying algebra? Why am I not out there in the world writing? And I struggled with that. In college, it got even worse. I really burnt out by the end of college, and then that was my first hospitalization. Was like a year out of college when my depression just became crippling.
You're saying something to me right now, and it's sending off flares, if you will. Are you a square peg that you've been trying to fit in a round hole your whole life?
I believe I am, and I believe my race plays part of that. I grew up in a very white community. I was
Yeah.
one of in grade school. I was one of two Japanese Americans in my class, and then we had an influx of Hmong refugees come to Minnesota. So Minnesota has become much more Asian American over the last 20 years. But growing up, I was one of two Asian American kids. I think we had two black kids in our class. So it was a very white community. And I never figured out how being of a different race blended in or did not blend in with my white colleagues. And I still think I struggle with that.
The reason I ask you that is because I think, and this is what is profound for me and how I've been able to turn my life around, is I fought against being a square peg, like, and tried to fit myself into round holes, right? That saying, if you will. Like, I tried that for 35 years. Couldn't figure out why I wasn't happy doing this, why I perceived things differently, why the equation on the chalkboard, I couldn't get to the same answer, or if I got to the same answer, it was through a different method and then was chastised because of it. How I processed information, all of these particular things. And I always felt like, why is the world against me? Why am I broken? What is wrong with me? All of these things. And then, I've talked about this on the podcast before, but at 35, I had a major life event. Okay. And so I look at life now as pre 35 and post 35. And post 35 has been a, a pretty incredible ride. And the reason I say that is because I stopped fighting out against my natural grain and embraced my differences as my differences, leaned in even. And by doing so, all of the things that I computated differently than others would, I now think of as slight superpowers, like, because I just use them in my work or in my life, and they're very effective. So that when you said that, it just sent off that flare to me.
I
That
think
it,
I had that experience on a much smaller level. When like in high school, when I determined, well, I'm a different race, so I'm a square peg because I don't fit in. Um, I decided to, at that point, kind of embrace it. I didn't want to be like everyone else. I wanted to be a unique individual. It started in high school that I wanted to write a book. I wanted to write my great masterpiece, and none of my classmates seemed all that interested in writing. But writing was critical for me. It helped me sort through my feelings and my thoughts and where the two interconnect. And others didn't seem to need that. So again, it was another example of me feeling like, why do I need to do this and no one else needs to do this? What's wrong with me? But because I love writing so much, because I don't want to be like everybody else, I embraced it in high school. But I think to a much smaller degree than you. I don't think it was like this
it was
big
a it was a
revelation.
massive thing for me. But
Yeah.
um, we keep coming back to race, and I think that that's an important topic, especially right now, when you're talking about. I remember seeing the things on the news and being literally, truly disgusted by it. And then also, what really made me angry on top of this is that there was other marginalized communities doing awful things to the Asian
Yep.
Americans or Asian people. And I was like, what is happening to this world? And regrettably, people just have a propensity to hate. And when they fear things and they lean to hate, and it really boggles my mind. Um, how this can happen, right? So you're an Asian American, and you know the pandemic initiated from China, so you're responsible. You, David Maeda, are responsible for that. So someone walking by who sees David Maeda, their mind goes to a place where they say, "I must harm this person, David Maeda, because he looks like where this pandemic originated from."
Yep.
Like, how does one get there? Like, how does that translate? And how broken does a human being have to be able to let that sort of anger fuel their actions?
Those are wonderful questions. I don't know how people get to that point. And one of the reasons, truthfully, the reason I wrote the memoir was if you look at me as a Japanese American, then the stereotypes you assign to Japanese Americans, you're going to automatically apply to me. Or in your example, you walk by me on the street and think I'm responsible for COVID. If I share my individual story of who David really is, you'll see me as an individual. Being Japanese American is part of who I am, but it's not entirely who I am. There are many different parts of me, which I so if people see each other as individual human beings, they're much less likely to have the mindset that you just laid out of looking at someone and hating them for just ridiculous reasons.
Well, and it's, so I had a guest on my podcast last week actually who is Jewish, who is talking about the increased Jewish hate in America right now, and I'm also befuddled because how is this man who he was in Canada actually he lives in Canada, sorry, how is this man, this Jewish man in Canada, responsible for Israel's president's actions? And then like it's not computing here, and people are not thinking, and it's from fear or ignorance, and it's driving me bonkers, and I don't know how to shake people to sense. Like it, you know what I mean? Like I get frustrated because I'm like, how do you start off with hate? How do
Yep.
you just look at someone and see hate or feel hate? Like it makes no sense to me. And I recognize that that's not my journey or my truth. So it's hard for me to comprehend or understand. I would love to actually have a conversation. It would be very hard for me, but to have a conversation from someone who does think that way, to try and understand what is driving that. Because it's just wrong. But also, besides just being wrong, if you strip everything else away, it's just stupid. It achieves nothing. Like, it achieves nothing to harm someone for something that happens on the other side of the world that they have zero control over.
Yep.
Like, it's just stupid.
Why
Anyway,
would you want? Why would you want to live where you're hating? I mean, you're not going to be a happy person, obviously.
no, no, I don't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I'm going to hate the world or hate whoever I come into contact with today.
Yep.
Like, we're in a situation right now, like, where we're very there's a lot of division in the US, and it spills over into Canada and surrounding regions. As much as I am disgusted and sickened by the actions of those who are in power, I don't hate them. I
Right.
don't understand them. I don't. What they're doing is wrong. The harm they're causing is wrong. But I don't have hate in my heart for them,
I
right?
don't. I don't know how we get more people to have that mindset.
I don't either. And that's just like all the people who support him or supported him and are now regretting it because that's happening.
Yep.
Um, like, we can't be like, well, I told you so and I have no empathy for you. The truth is, they made a decision. Everybody makes mistakes. We have to give them love, right? We have to show them kindness. And I think, oh my gosh, her name just went. I loved what Jane Fonda said. I saw the
Yep.
clip. We
Yep.
need a really big tent for those people because we want to bring them in and show them love.
Yep.
So this is not who we are. Is your memoir. It talks about your experiences. You give a lot of election knowledge, and you give things about your depression. You say that you were hospitalized for your depression. Like, where do you think and it still lasts today, where do you think that your depression comes from? What is it that overcomes you to keep you in a state of sad?
I think it's this like I mentioned before, this continuing need of mine, which to find the meaning behind everything. That
Okay.
I think that drives my writing. That I need to write my what's going on in my life so I can find some meaning behind what's going on in my life. And then we get into that circle of, well, other people don't seem to need this. Is there something wrong with me? Other people, like, I've had a hard time, honestly, moving on from 2020 when I lived by myself. So most of the year I was totally in isolation, solitary confinement, basically. And when the world reopened up, I had a hard time getting back out and doing
Of course.
things I used to enjoy doing. But I look at people now and they're it's like 2020 never happened. And I just am not of that mindset, I guess. I think that
Well,
drives my depression.
I think that there's a lot of people who want to pretend like it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So they pedal to the metal, right? And they're just going at life. During that experience, the 2020, it was hard on me, and I had a similar experience like when life just started up again and everything was sort of back to normal, the new normal, readjusting to being in crowds or traffic. The pandemic destroyed any of the patience I had for traffic. I don't even enjoy driving anymore because of traffic. So, but one thing I like to remind people always is that the pandemic was a global traumatic experience. It has changed every single person in varying degrees. Even though you don't think it might have changed you and you think you fared well, you will notice if you pay attention that there are certain things that you did before that you don't enjoy anymore. You have less tolerance for specific things. You will, if you look at yourself and reflect, you will notice that since the pandemic you have undergone change, and that is because we went through a very large period of time where we were afraid. We did not know the outcome when this first started. I think everybody thought, okay, a few days and that'll be that.
Yep.
This lasted for really like 2 years if you want to think about it. So, how could you go through something like that, be limited, not sure where, money was going to come from, access to job, healthcare? If you go outside, are you going to die? There was a lot of misinformation and things like that. Just basic necessities. How do you think you can go through that as a privileged culture as we are in North America with access to so many different things and not think that you wouldn't be changed to a degree or be affected by that,
Yep.
right? Um, so you always want to define meaning to everything. So this is how you classify yourself. Is it because, and this is just me asking a question, is it because you don't know what the meaning of David Maeda is yet?
Wow, that's a deep question. I think that's definitely a large part of it. I don't think I've really, even in writing my memoir, um, that's the title. It's not who I am. It's part of who I am, but there's certainly parts of in the memoir or that I didn't include in the memoir. Um, so yeah, I think I am searching for who I really am.
Okay. And then you're frustrated because others seem to know who they are.
Or they can live without knowing who they are.
They can live with. Okay. And so I'm trained, not practicing. So my brain always thinks of certain things and you don't have to answer. So if you were to visualize the rest of your life without knowing truly what the meaning of your life was, what does that do for you? Does it send you into a panic attack?
Yes. Well, one of the things my current therapist really is focused on is that very thing. Like before my memoir came out, we talked about what does success look like, which gets me away from living in the moment, by the way, envisioning what a successful life for me actually looks like and get me thinking down that lane. And I don't think I have that picture in my head right now.
And that's fine. That's fine. It takes time and everybody takes time. Have you ever pondered the statement that, or the truth rather, that David Maeda is enough?
I have. It's funny you should ask that. One of the working titles of the memoir is I am enough."
Okay.
So yeah, I have pondered that. I don't think I believe it, but I have thought about it.
I love that you're in therapy. I love that you're being vulnerable and you're talking about it. I think there's so many things about who you are. And I always, there's this theme in my mind that what if what you're doing right now in the life that you have led to date is exactly what your purpose is? To be a marginalized male talking about mental health in a public arena.
Yeah, that,
right? Like,
I don't know if that's a comforting thought, but it's definitely a positive thought that I'll take with me.
well, you have to look at everything, I think, because like you wrote a book. This is not who we are. You have shared deepness with individuals by you being here on this podcast and any other podcast. You are opening up your story for countless others to potentially learn from, grow from, begin their own healing journey. So that takes courage, right? And
Yep.
vulnerability. Um, and I think that that's something that you need to be proud of, because I know from my training that in all Asian cultures, from what I've understood and read and researched, that talking about mental health issues is not culturally appropriate
Correct.
and not understood at all. So for you to do that, I don't know how far my podcast will reach or how far your book will reach, but let's just say that one young Japanese man watches this podcast or reads that book and is liberated by your story.
That's absolutely a one. It's actually in my book, where I read
Oh,
about the purpose of my book is, or the purpose of wanting to write a book was to change the world. That was always my goal growing up. I wanted to create this masterpiece that would just completely change the world into a better place. And then as I was writing my memoir, I really thought, well, that's not going to happen. How many books have I read that have completely changed the world? But the books that I have read that have changed me as an individual, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to write something that would help somebody, as you mentioned, a young Japanese American, um, feel more comfortable about who he is and what his place in this world is, I guess. And so that was one of the goals of the book.
I would challenge you to define worlds. And I want to explain myself, because you wanted to write a book that's going to change the world. Whose world? Your world or someone else's world? Because arguably, if you help that one young Japanese American man or Asian man be more vulnerable and talk about and feel their emotions, then you are in effect changing their world, right? So you've written a book, it's out. You said now that since the book's been out, you're feeling a little low on this end of it. What's next for you?
Well, I'm trying to do some, like I have a reading at my college next week. So I'm trying to get out there and do readings. I'm trying to do as many podcasts as I can. I guess I'm not a marketing person, but I'm trying to get comfortable in marketing my book because I do want people to read it. It was 12 years in the making, and I really want people to read it.
It seems to be doing well. Like,
Yep.
for an unknown author, right? For an initial release, it seems to be doing well. So I think you're on the right track. You're having conversations about it. You're going to go read it in front of people. That makes me want to vomit, only because like I would be so nervous to do that. But I love that when people do that. And so I think you're on the right track. Do you think you have another book in you?
So
Or
when
maybe
when I finished this one, I thought there's no way there's going to be a volume two. I just put I don't have 12 years to write another book and go through all that emotion of writing a book. But there have been things like we talked about the delay in getting it published. Um, I had prior to my hospitalization this past summer, I happened to randomly run into my original muse, the girl that inspired me to become a writer 40 years ago, who I hadn't seen since we graduated. And so there have been things that have gone on since the publication of the book that I do want to kind of to dig deeper into it, to what our earlier discussion, what the meaning of all that really was.
I love this. But are you interested in fiction?
Shortly out of college, I did try to write a novel, and I didn't think I was very good at it. But yeah, I'd be interested in writing
Well,
it in a genre I'm not used to writing in, I guess.
I read through three of your blog posts. I think you're great at writing.
Well, thank
Your
you.
your first, I didn't have a lot of time, but I was reading through them, and you seem very structured in how you want to get to where you're going and where you want to take your reader, right? So I think the world's your oyster. So you can go do whatever David sets out to. I know that's easier said than done, and I don't know David personally, but I do believe this was 12 years in the making. But sometimes you have to age wine
Yep.
before it's ready for consumption, right? Once you crack the cork, though, it starts to flow. So if that's maybe your future, who knows? Maybe there's more books, more fiction books, or a part two. Who knows?
I like that thought.
Yes. Well, I want to say thank you very much for being a guest on the show today. You have been a delight to talk to, and I wish you tremendously well in your success and in your healing journey and finding purpose and who you are. So, for everybody at home, you can actually go to.
I actually got a website up, so that might be the easiest way to find my blog and find my book.
Cheap or Record, right?
It's davidmaeda.com. I just got that up and running not too long ago.
Oh, okay. So, all right, give me a second. So we're going to make sure that that's included, that you can find it. So davidmaeda.com.
Yep.
And then you can also find his book. Where is your book available now? On Amazon?
It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Any bookstore can order it for you.
Perfect. Amazing. So I would recommend for everyone to get out there, purchase a copy of David Maeda's book, read about elections, because that's a fascinating thing, but also read about the intertwining stories of David's life throughout that as well. And keep an eye out for potential future publications and his blog as well. So, wish you the best. And I thank you so much for being on the show today. And for everybody else out there who is watching, get out there and live your wildest dreams. Until next time.
Thank you.
For media and sponsorship inquiries, email info@cksims.com or visit cksims.com and fill out the contact form. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. A new episode airs every Saturday. CKS Media.